Dead Republicans are rising from their grave to stop the monsters in their place. Like, subscribe, share with your friends and family, and leave a comment below.
Hey, let's talk about dead Republicans. Have you heard about the radical Republicans? They were the faction that basically took over Congress after the Civil War. I'll get to that in just a second. But what I want to lay out, the headline on my piece today over Hartmann Report: Radical Republicans reach out from the grave. The Congress must expel some members and punish the states. How do you do this? It's the 14th Amendment. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Thaddeus Stevens in the House, Charles Sumner in the Senate. Stevens had been a Massachusetts lawyer before he came to the House of Representatives. He represented Massachusetts in the U.S. House back in the 1860s. And when he was a lawyer in Massachusetts before this, part of his practice was helping people who had escaped, black people who had escaped from the South, get legal paperwork in Massachusetts certifying that they were now free citizens of Massachusetts. This is what he did for a living, or it's what he did on the side, actually. It wasn't paid work, but it was a big part of his life. And he went into Congress, and then Charles Sumner from South Carolina was, he was not from, Charles Sumner was not from South Carolina. He was beaten up by a guy from South Carolina. Charles Sumner was beaten up by Preston Brooks in 1856, 4 years before the Civil War, because he was opposing slavery in the Senate. So you had the radical Republican Sumner in the Senate, the radical Republican Stevens in the House, and they championed and passed these three pieces of legislation: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ended slavery except for people who are convicted of a crime. Slavery is still legal in the United States, which is why our prisons operate the way they do. But the 13th Amendment ended slavery for everything other than a crime. The 15th Amendment granted voting rights to former slaves. And the 14th Amendment, which is the key one here, has a whole bunch of provisions. It's got 5 articles. Article 1 establishes birthright citizenship, which was specifically intended to establish, in a way that could not be questioned, the citizenship of formerly enslaved human beings here in the United States, thus the birthright citizenship. And secondly, it says that the number of members that a state may send to the House of Representatives is proportionate to the number of voting citizens they have. And that's a pretty big deal. It says, the first part, this eliminates the 3/5 provision that was in the Constitution for counting black people basically in states. They eliminated that with this language in the 14th Amendment, Section 2. It says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. But then it goes on to say, and this is actually a very long piece, the second sentence of Section 2 of Article 4 of the 14th Amendment. It's got a whole bunch of stuff in it about white men and age 21 and all that. So I'm deleting all that in my quote. So this is an abridged quote, but this is the essence of it. It says, but when the right to vote at any election is denied to citizens of the United States or in any way abridged, keep that in mind, the basis of representation therein, in other words, the number of members that a state can send to the House of Representatives, the basis of representative therein shall be reduced in proportion which the number of such citizens shall bear to the whole number of citizens in such a state. In other words, if you can demonstrate that Georgia prevented 20% of their people from voting in the last election through 8-hour lines or knocking them off the voter rolls or whatever, if you can demonstrate that 20% of the voters in Georgia were not allowed to vote in the last election, you can reduce the size of Georgia's congressional delegation by 20%. So if they've got 10 people going to the House, and I frankly don't know off the top of my head, but if they had 10 people going to the House, they would lose 2. So that's the second section of the 14th Amendment. But the third section really gets juicy. And again, I'll abridge it. It says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress who has, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. that Congress may by a vote of 2/3 of each house remove such disability. So what it says basically is if a member of Congress engages in insurrection or encourages it or even provides aid and comfort to it, they may be removed from Congress by a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. Now, the problem is both of these provisions basically got blown up. The Article 5 of the 14th Amendment says that Congress can pass legislation to make any of this stuff happen, right? Quote, the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. But and Congress had done that in the 1860s. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. Congress had done that in 1869. But that was blown up in 1872 by the Amnesty Act. This was an attempt to bring the southern states back, hoping that the southern states would start behaving themselves. It didn't work. But it basically ended Congress's ability to enforce the Article 2 or Section 2 and Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So Congress needs to pass a law right now, and this is what I'm calling for in my piece over at HartmannReport.com today, and we're pushing it out far and wide, and I've shared it with a couple of members of Congress who come on this program. Congress, in my opinion, and if you know anything about this, feel free to challenge me on this or support me, because this is kind of an obscure piece of constitutional law, but it sure seems to me that what Congress needs to be doing right now is passing a law that says explicitly that any state that suppresses the vote loses members of the House of Representatives in proportion to that suppression of the vote. Just clearly state it. Put them on notice, number one. That's Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. And then with regard to Section 3, we need to pass legislation, and it could be the same piece of legislation. They both have to do with the 14th Amendment. With Section 3, we need to pass legislation saying that any member of Congress who has engaged in seditious acts can be removed. Period. Now, they could perhaps say even with a simple majority vote, although that would run into a constitutional challenge because the 14th Amendment says a 2/3 majority, and I get that. But hey, grab the brass ring when it comes by. So, bottom line, the Constitution provides Congress with the ability to police their own members with regard to sedition and to police the states with regard to voter suppression. And, again, this came out of the 14th Amendment, which came out of the end of the Civil War. At that point in time, the southern states were not part of the Union. By 1868, I'm pretty sure that maybe one or two of them had, at that point, reformed their constitutions. In other words, reconstructed their constitutions so that they could rejoin the United States. But it certainly wasn't the whole bunch of them. And this was an attempt, the 14th Amendment was a clear attempt by these radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens in large part, who in 1868, I forget the year he died. I think it was 68. But when he died, he stipulated in his will that he wanted to be buried in a cemetery that included black people. And so they took him to Pennsylvania and they buried him in an integrated cemetery. I don't know if there were none in Massachusetts where he was from or not, but Thaddeus Stevens is an amazing story. Back then, the Republicans were the good guys. Of course, that was 150 years ago. Or 160 years ago. So that dynamic has changed.